Honored to have Dr. Lara Briden, and you're a doctor of naturopathic medicine, author
Yep.
of 3 books. I've read all of them. So
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah.
I think the
Um,
first one, and I would like to go, if you don't mind, I would like to go a little bit in order.
sure.
Just high
Absolutely.
level,
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
just high level to touch on some of the topics and really get into the metabolism after we get a little initial intro. But I did initially read this for the reasons I was saying, working with women and getting a better
Yeah.
understanding of that. And then the hormone repair, because I think it specifically addresses a lot of, especially once you get over 40 and those perimenopausal symptoms and transitioning, as you call
Yep.
it, to second puberty. And
Yep.
then the thing that I think a lot of our audience and clients will be familiar with is an approach that
Yeah.
metabolism to kind of, as you know, and I would actually like your input on this. I feel like so many people are looking at nutrition specifically just to lose fat. And I think the piece that was so good about your book was it's introducing that you're trying to fix the metabolism, and then the fat is almost more of a symptom of a broken metabolism.
I guess I would frame it as, fat burning is the natural human default state. So if we're kind of locked out of fat burning, fat burning hasn't been happening the way it's supposed to, then that's a symptom that something's not right. So it's trying to come back to fat burning is coming back to, our birthright in a way, back to our default. So yeah, we can
I
explore
almost look
that a
at
bit more.
I almost look at it like it's not sexy to talk about health. A lot of times people don't buy nutritional type products and services or look to turn nutrition
Yeah.
or health. A lot of times people are looking for how they're going to look on vacation or something like that. But I feel like what I like so much about your book is the best way to do it is actually to fix that health.
Well, since you brought up the two books, I'll do a comparison. So in Period Repair Manual, the first book you showed, I make the case that the period is the monthly report card. I basically make the case that having a healthy, symptomless, regular period is an expression of general health. With this book, well, then the second book, it was like having a fairly easy perimenopause transition can be an expression of general health. And with this book, having a healthy metabolism, but specifically what I mean by that is having metabolic flexibility and good insulin sensitivity. We can get into that, but having that is an expression of general health. So it isn't just about, as we've just said, it isn't just about dialing in the perfect diet and exercise. I mean, and or doing some arithmetic around, around what that's supposed to look like. I mean, you can scribble some numbers down, but at the end of the day, your body has its own thing going on, and there's, especially in, I say it's even more so in women than in men, our bodies can be
Yeah,
quite,
I agree.
the phrase that gets used is quite resistant to fat loss, but that's not how the body sees it. It's like it's trying to survive, like it has some plans and some things it's trying to do. Yeah, so you can't just like try to outsmart that. You have to say, what does the body need? Like, what's going on here? What are the, why is it inflamed? What are the problems that you can try to address?
Well, let's start with this book, just because
Okay.
as you said, it is a report card, a monthly report card on your health. And I love how you put it that way. What is it that when you wrote this, that
Yeah.
you wanted women to take away from it? What is it that you wanted women to understand to improve their health so they can have that healthy report card?
At that time, back when I wrote that 10 years ago, I really felt like periods had been given a bad name. They'd kind of been siloed or compartmentalized into like the too hard basket, really. It's like we've sort of this attitude, well, we've got health and then we've got period health. And sometimes period health is very unruly. And so when that's happening, you just have to shut it all down with hormonal birth control. Obviously, I have a lot to say about hormonal birth control in that book. And so, but my key message isn't even, the pill is bad. That's not the key message. The key message is the body wants to have a healthy, symptomless periods. There's nothing inherently about periods that should be difficult or symptomatic. So, and through my 25 or at that time 20 years, 20 almost 20 years of experience with patients, I had just seen time and time again when you support the body, give it what it needs, the periods in most cases will improve and become symptomless. And so many, stories where patients were just like, oh my goodness, I didn't even realize, like, my period just arrived and I just, bled for 4 days and it was not a big deal. And I didn't have strong, headaches, or I didn't have pain, and, I say that I do understand there's always going to be someone listening going, well, but I'm different, I'm broken. I've got these really serious period problems. I get that. I mean, there could be things like endometriosis, and there obviously are going to be situations where it's more complicated. But my experience is still, for the majority of women, having a healthy natural cycle menstrual cycle is very doable.
To that point, I have a 16-year-old daughter.
Oh,
Uh,
good. Yeah.
and to tie it to health and a little bit to nutrition as we go here, does seem like women or girls are having their periods earlier. Diet and nutrition can play a part on that. A number of things can have a part on that. What is it at that age? Like if I'm talking to moms and I'm trying to make them aware for their own daughters, what is normal as a cycle comes on? And I know I don't want to use the word normal because I understand how that can be taken differently. The
Yeah.
period be inconsistent in the beginning, and that
Yeah.
is okay because sometimes I think parents may rush to the birth control or to fix some underlying problems. But explain that process and how it would naturally take if it was healthy and normal as it came on to life for a teenage girl.
The initial bleeds with a young girl and young teens usually. I mean, that sort of average age has moved down a little bit. Still, the average age is around 11 point something. Some girls are much younger, obviously. That's some debate, what's happening around that. But yes, at that young age, those first few bleeds are not actually menstrual cycles. It's kind of just the body getting started. It's like the ovaries are pumping out some estrogen. It's like, the communication between the brain and the ovaries is just starting up. And so that's a big part of why the initial cycles are not, we would never expect them to be like a 30-day cycle right from the beginning. That would be crazy. It's just sort of getting going. And then, as ovulation, which is the main event of the menstrual cycle, becomes more regulated by the brain, then you get a beautiful hormone coming online called progesterone, which helps to lighten the flow and make periods a lot easier. And so periods will definitely get easier. So not only should they get more regular if all is going well, but they should get lighter. They should get, be less painful. So the initial, for different reasons, the first few periods or the first, year or two of periods can be quite heavy. That's not unusual and not the rule, but like yeah. And it's hard. I mean, if you've got a 12-year-old who's like, bleeding onto her sheets at night, or this can be quite distressing. And so I do talk about that in Period to Perimenopause, like some just simple tips. Like most teenage girls respond quite well to some simple things just to lighten flow while their body's maturing. And also likewise with period pain, it can respond pretty well to some simple things, and therefore hopefully prevent going on the pill at that young age, especially when they don't even need contraception yet. They're just, it's the pill is being used to manage
Right.
those symptoms. And there's so many other ways. And the problem with bringing the pill on board so young is it switches off the whole process. So that like maturation or communication between the brain and the ovaries, the combined oral contraceptive will just almost any type of hormonal birth control will just like shut that down. And so then, unfortunately, what we know from the research is then, a decade or 2 decades, sometimes decades later, when the woman comes off the pill, of course, like that maturation process hasn't happened. So it still has to happen. So that's one explanation for why there can be irregular ovulation, or in some cases, no ovulation for a while after coming off the pill. It's really good for a girl to get some like years of menstrual cycling under her belt just to, mature what's happening with the communication.
So I want to use that as an introduction to, if you don't mind, I would love for you to
Yeah.
explain high level, the basic hormonal cycle that happens through, your menstrual cycle. Because I think this is actually
Yeah.
blows my mind. I work with a lot of women, and it
Yeah.
does blow my mind how few understand what they do go through and how it does impact them and what is healthy.
Yeah.
So if you can explain that, because I think
Yeah.
we'll call back on that on other topics that come up. What does the normal
Sure.
cycle look like? And then also, what is the pill not allowing to happen in that hormonal
Yeah. Well,
cycle?
let's start with that actually. So the pill, okay, just say again, ovulation is the main event of the menstrual cycle. That's the hormonal event. And I will describe, what those hormonal events, the sequence is in a minute. But like, it's not just that ovulation is not just the release of the egg from the ovary. It's how the ovary goes through its whole sequence of making hormones. And that entire process of ovulation and then the 2 weeks after ovulation in an adult woman the median is about 28 days. But of course, I'm sure you've heard lots of people say it's like hardly anyone has exactly a 28-day cycle, but that's, approximately how long it takes the human brain and ovary to do that. So that's where the monthly cycle comes in. The pill switches that off, like entirely switches that off. So just to be clear, I mean, just one thing I can say categorically, there's no medical reason to bleed monthly on the pill, like zero. So, if for whatever reason, and some women want to take the pill for avoiding pregnancy or something like that, like that's fine, but like there's no reason to have a monthly bleed on that. That's not a menstrual cycle. And it's crazy to be prescribed the pill to regulate the menstrual cycle, because it doesn't do that at all. But back to what is happening with a natural menstrual cycle. It takes approximately a month in young women, like teenagers and even into their early 20s. It's longer than a month. So cycles are generally longer in younger women and shorten into the perimenopause, into women's 40s. So you will get women in their 40s saying, always had a 29-day cycle and now it's like 24 days. It's like, that's pretty normal. That's what starts to happen. But so what happens is this, it's all very quiet, almost radio silence, like right at day one of the cycle, which is day one of the bleed. It's all, the previous cycle is all done. The brain and the ovaries are just all quiet. There's very little estrogen. There's no progesterone at that stage. The brain hasn't really started signaling the ovaries yet. So it's just this like baseline. That's day one. And that's day one of the proper bleed. So if a woman has spotting, she needs to count that as that's the previous cycle. So day one of like flow, that is day one of the cycle. And then around, depending on your age, you start to get, the brain starts talking to the ovaries. It's like, let's go, let's do it again. And, it starts waking up the ovaries and they start making estrogen in response to that. And that can actually usually feels quite good actually when estrogen starts to kick in a lot. Not all, there's exceptions because there's always individuality for what's going on. And I have talked about this in a lot of my work, but on average, women can start to feel quite good as they head into that high estrogen phase leading up to ovulation. We get a little testosterone surge, the tiniest blip in testosterone just before ovulation. And in the research, it's crazy. It just improves women's, sports performance, this like euphoria, this little testosterone feels good. And because women don't have a lot of it, but that small amount just makes quite a difference. So that's ovulation. And to be fair, some women get kind of anxiety symptoms with that, but most women feel great. And then you get sort of a drop in estrogen after ovulation. And then that's when progesterone kicks in. So this is the hormone that's made only after ovulation. It's lots of different opinions about what progesterone is doing, but it's generally quite immune modulating in a good way. It's sort of anti-inflammatory. It is quite calming for the nervous system. It can definitely, I'd say if nothing else, it does make women feel just a little more introverted, which is not a bad thing. Like it's sort of, you don't have that euphoria, outgoing euphoria pre-ovulation, but you feel a little bit more, which is fine. A lot of women sort of harness that power to cycle, sync their life a little bit with their cycle. And also progesterone does increase appetite. So this would be relevant for people listening. It's 100% normal to feel hungrier in that second half of the cycle. In fact, estrogen is an appetite suppressant. So during the high estrogen, just before ovulation, women's hunger will go down. They'll just feel more like, actually there's research that estrogen makes women feel more like moving the body and getting out there, just like exploring the world. And so, that could be quite a great time to achieve some, fitness goals perhaps. And, but then know that you've got this other phase coming in where the other hormone is just telling you to take it a bit more easy, maybe, although women can still do sports in any part of the cycle, but, feeling hungrier.
Is that naturally aligning with supporting life? You mentioned immune benefits. You mentioned being a little more introverted. Like, so that could, does it imply anything like safety? Like, so if you were creating a baby in theory, what
100%.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I'm an evolutionary biologist by background before I became a naturopathic doctor. So yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to apply that lens. Like pre-ovulation, women are in seeking behavior. That includes seeking mate. I mean, it's not always a sexual thing, obviously, but like it's like go out into the world. That's the time to explore. And then after ovulation, potentially, let's let's see. We might be about to make a baby. We might want to eat a bit more. And yes, I mean that's part of it. Because we're cyclic beings, we're animals.
But I like
and
making
then
a connection because I think sometimes these words and they just think it's like something in them, and all these things have a purpose within the body and do contribute to behaviors and feelings and hunger and all this stuff. So I always like making that connection to there's a why behind why this is happening for people.
Absolutely. The body's smart, and well, the female body in particular, I would say the female body in particular is smart, but obviously the male body is too. So, a lot of my reframing, especially in this latest book, you would have seen, I've just kind of like to reframe female as the standard normal version of physiology, and then male, the quirky, weird variant, which is, from a biology perspective, is equally valid. I mean, actually, my early work in evolutionary biology was studying female bats, female mammals, what they do. So anyway, yeah, females have a cyclic nature, which is normal for us, and then later in the cycle, if there's no pregnancy, if there has been no conception, then both estrogen and progesterone start to drop at the end of the cycle. And that's a bit rough. That can feel, that definitely is going to increase hunger even more. Actually, that's estrogen going down at that point. Obviously some women do experience distressing symptoms with that, but the problem isn't the dropping hormones, it's themselves. The problem is, when healthy, if the body and the brain are healthy, then it should be able to adapt and have resilience to those dropping hormones, which is a totally normal occurrence. And so any amount of inflammation, for example, or just dysregulated HPA or like adrenal axis issues can make that downward, the roller coaster of hormones can make that a little bit more symptomatic, but it shouldn't be symptomatic. There's lots of ways to support that without switching off hormones. So I hope that, gives the broad strokes.
What are the things that you notice as the biggest contributors to what causes premenstrual pains and like bleeds that are more painful, or a lot of the symptoms that go along with menstruation and that cycle? What are the common things you see? I know nothing fits everyone. Everyone is very individual, but I feel like even with nutrition, there's an 80% rule. There's some things that we're all violating. What do you see that could be the biggest quick fixes for people or easy areas to focus on in their life?
Yeah, it's a valid question. And I do a bit of that in my books, is like, yes, it's there's lots of factors, but at the end of the day, people have to have a few things to just try. And I'm in favor of that. So one of the biggest drivers of period pain, I would say, is gut issues. So any amount of like food sensitivity, histamine reaction in the gut, or intestinal permeability, or is potentially going to drive period pain. And it's actually partly, it sounds weird, but it's just proximity, right? Like the gut and the uterus, like it's all kind of there in the pelvis. And when there's like a lot of inflammation going on there, that can translate into period symptoms. That can also drive endometriosis, but endometriosis can be a topic for another day. But the other, and I guess the big like double hit that I would try for a lot of teenagers, for example, I said earlier that teenage period pain and can respond quite well. What I usually do with my own patients, and what I recommend in the book, is try a few months off normal dairy. So it's weird and quirky that cow's dairy is so kind of unfriendly to periods in a way. A lot of it's to do with a histamine reaction that some people get to cow's dairy. And brought like big perspective, I think there's lots of good things about dairy, actually, like protein and some healthy types of fats. And so I'm not anti-dairy generally. You'll see in the books, I differentiate between A1 and A2 dairy. So that's what I found clinically to make a big difference. So A1 is the kind of the Friesian, Holstein, I guess in North America, it'd be Holstein cows that don't even exist. Like Southern Europe doesn't even have those. It's a different, depending on where you're in the world, dairy would be quite different. But Australia, New Zealand, North America does use this breed of cows that makes an inflammatory protein that's inflammatory for some people, but not everyone. So some people are fine even with A1 casein dairy, and they're the people who are like, I don't understand the big deal. Dairy's fine, dairy's healthy. It's like, sure, for them. But for people with a dairy sensitivity, it can manifest very much in periods. So that's just an easy way I talk about in the book about like some easy you look for clues when you were a kid. If you had like recurrent ear infections or recurrent tonsillitis or any of those signs of potentially immune distress potentially from dairy, then you might have outgrown those things, but now you've got, period, both pain, heavy bleeding to some extent, and premenstrual mood to some extent. So very often with young, especially girls, I'll say just switch them over to A2 dairy, which is like goat or sheep, or there's now more and more cows that they call A2, so they don't have the A1 casein. They've just been bred to not have it. Some breeds just naturally don't have it. And then so that's one. And then the other thing is zinc. And it sounds boring, but zinc has actually undergone at least one randomized clinical trial, where they're like, whoa, zinc performed as well as the pill in terms of suppressing period pain. But in that research, which was quite amusing to me, they're like, but zinc is cheaper than the pill. And I'm like, right. And also it doesn't switch off the menstrual cycle. So there's that as well. It lets you have a menstrual cycle and also
Surprised you even put
relieves
that
pain.
report out.
Yeah. So zinc is anti-inflammatory and also a lot of young women aren't getting enough zinc. And we know that from other bits of research. It's quite an easy one to take. But I will just say if anyone's going to take zinc, if they haven't done, just be careful because zinc on an empty stomach can make you feel sick to your stomach. But all you have to do is take it with food and it's usually fine. I always like to mention that because someone rushes out and takes it and then they're like, oh, I can't take it because that made me feel sick.
So you brought up the high level, a healthy cycle. And this will
Yeah.
almost lead a little bit into the topic I actually wanted to bring up from the hormone repair manual. Do you notice you talked a little bit in the peer repair and everywhere where you are going through your cycle, you're bleeding, but you're not actually ovulating. So you could be
Yes,
kind of
right.
into thinking you're going through a natural cycle, but you're not. What are the main factors that could contribute to that? Could you explain that a little
Yeah.
bit? And
Very,
I want to
yeah,
ask
keep
you
going.
about type A personalities of people who constantly go, are overstressed, and that HPA
Yeah.
access that you talk about in the book.
Very good question. And actually, you must have read my mind because back, 10 minutes ago when I was describing the menstrual cycle, I did part of my brain was like, oh, and remember to mention about anovulatory cycles. So yes, so that's good, perfect timing with the question. So there has been this sort of assumption, like even in science, even in medicine, which is very weird, that if you're having a bleed, then you must have ovulated. That is incorrect. So it is 100% possible to make estrogen, like the body trying, as in the body trying to ovulate, but never actually getting there, never making any progesterone, and then eventually just having kind of a what they call like a breakthrough bleed, like eventually just part of the uterine lining just lets go. And or lets go in response to kind of estrogen going down again. But that's not a menstrual cycle. And big picture, it's actually not ideal to be constantly having anovulatory cycles. That's the main feature of polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS is to have, well, depending on the person, but and if you're in the situation of having like all anovulatory cycles and never ovulating, that's not good and can lead to things like buildup of the uterine lining and other problems. So what can cause that? So we do know from the science from my colleague, reproductive endocrinologist Geraldine Pryor. She's not only cited but done some of the research herself to demonstrate that women normally, even a perfectly healthy woman where everything's going great, will have 2 or 3 cycles in a year where she doesn't ovulate, or where she like ovulates but not very well, if you will, like has quite a short luteal phase. So these are, or luteal phase being the part of the cycle where you're supposed to make progesterone. That can be, there's a sort of a gradation there. It can just be not enough, or it can just be not happening at all. And so that can definitely just be a reaction to stress. So we know that very clearly in the research. It kind of which makes sense because if the brain perceives that something's wrong, like it could be like the brain doesn't know it, like it could be war, it could be,
Right.
your life is in danger, it's not a good time to have a baby, or there's not enough food. Well, not eating enough is a really common one. If something's wrong, yeah, the body will just not ovulate and just be like, nope, we're not going to take a gamble on that. That does not seem like a good time. We're going to like conserve resources and wait till things are in better conditions. So yes, so stress can play a
I
role,
think that
certainly
speaks to the
illness. Yeah,
evolutionary part that you're speaking of.
yeah,
The body has an intuitive.
totally. Yeah, which is why I say in Period to Pair Manual, if you want to coax your brain, your body into having a regular period, you need to coax your brain into thinking everything's in good shape to have a baby, even if you don't want a baby. So it's not about actually whether you want a baby or not. It's like whether your body thinks that's a reasonable course of action. So a big mechanism of women either not having ovulatory cycles, so having anovulatory cycles, or having lots of time in between cycles, or um, not cycling at all, not bleeding at all, even in some cases, is undereating. So that's becoming more common, and it's just very well established in the research. That's what can happen. Undereating in general, undereating calories, undereating protein, undereating carbohydrates in some cases. That has been controversial in the past to say that, but I'll just say seems to be genetically calibrated. So some women just, I think just depending on their ancestry, their brain is waiting for a certain carbohydrate signal as to like just basically just sort of symbolize, signify how much food there is.
Yep.
It makes sense to me from an evolutionary perspective. It would be maybe people who are descended from people who ate a lot, starch was a big part of their diet. That's going to be part of the signal. So that's actually a handy thing that women have is your period can tell you if you've what's going on with your diet, if that's enough for your individual body or not. And one thing to keep in mind with that, though, there is a lag time, so it's not instant. It can take 4 months or sometimes more to lose your period from under eating, and likewise it can take inverse. It can take 6 months or more to get it back. We have to, so it takes a while for the brain to just turn the ship around. And then the other common reason I mentioned polycystic ovary syndrome. So that's around that's a different sort of problem. That's not the undereating problem. It's just there is disrupted signaling between the brain and the ovaries for lots of theories about what causes that. But a main feature of it will be elevated testosterone, which is not great for women's bodies. That promotes insulin resistance. Definitely is both kind of a cause and a feature of the inability to ovulate regularly. So obviously then testosterone also causes, facial hair, weight gain around the middle.
Can I ask you a
Yeah.
question? Why would elevated testosterone in a woman promote those negative behaviors, but in a
I
man
know.
be
I
very
know.
make a
I
guy want
know.
to work and feel great?
Well, I think it's just how male and female are calibrated differently. So there is, you can put in the links in the show notes. There are a couple of papers that come to mind that I have cited, I think, on my blog, talking about, that sex difference in response to testosterone. So you're right. Like in men, higher testosterone seems to promote better insulin sensitivity, whereas in women it's the opposite. And again, it's going to depend on the level. So there's a sweet spot. I don't want to make it sound like testosterone's all bad for women. That's not the case. Like I talked about that little pre-ovulation testosterone surge is quite good, and we actually have 1/10 the amount that men have, but we do have quite a bit of testosterone in the body. That is good for muscle mass, and obviously that's indirectly good for insulin sensitivity. So there's a sweet spot, but definitely having elevated testosterone, very well established in the literature, that in a female body will promote insulin resistance. It will promote the redistribution of fat from subcutaneous kind of lower body, where it's actually really good and beneficial, to the visceral, that inside, around the internal organs. Testosterone promotes that actually in both sexes to some degree, but particularly in women. So yeah, but it's actually why it's also called, that's type of visceral fat's also called android fat, or sort of the male type fat
So
distribution. But
what could someone do to be aware if they were not actually ovulating during their cycle? Is there any?
right, yeah. So the best way to know is temperature tracking, and in the modern age, that's super easy. I mean, I'm curious how many, if like how many of your at the gym, how many of your clients are using Oura Ring or some other wearable to kind of track their basal body temperatures. So we can tell, so the handy sign of ovulation is when progesterone comes online just after ovulation, it increases body temperature by about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, 0.3 degree Celsius.
Okay.
Is that happening in your gym? Do you know people who are
A lot of people are
tracking?
using them, but we don't have them integrated into we don't have any software or anything in our gyms that's integrating them in any way. But yes, they are extremely common.
Well, there's a lot of apps that'll track. So of course women I did and can still do it the old fashioned way, where you just every morning you take a temperature under the tongue and you write it down, and then you
Yep.
look at the graph, and it's not a subtle thing. It's like, I have had so many patients who are like, oh, I'm not sure, am I ovulating or not? I'm like, if you were ovulating, you'd know. Like it's not a subtle, it's like there's a
There's a
there's
spike
a
up.
increase.
Is
There's
that for
like
how
goes
long
up.
will they see the spike up?
It goes up and stays up for about the 2 weeks of the luteal phase, and then it comes
They'll
down
stay up for
again.
the full 2 weeks?
Yep.
Oh,
A
okay.
healthy luteal phase, because it's as long as progesterone's online, it'll go
Okay.
up and stay up. So it's like a step up. It's not like a single spike. It's like you've got well, it's always, you've got a chatter
Right,
of
right.
up and down temperatures, and then a
And it
trend to
stays
up, and
there.
then it should stay up.
And it
It should stay
wouldn't
up. And
stay
of course,
up it wouldn't go up if they were not ovulating.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's just, and people, of course, just, just to give the whole story, people are using that for identifying fertile window and you, like people need to look into how you do that, but it can be used to potentially avoid pregnancy. So I know, I mean, not to mention any brands specifically, I don't have any affiliation, but I know, like, for example, the Aura Ring pairs with one of the algorithms for avoiding pregnancy natural cycles. So you can not only get your temperature graph of confirming ovulation, but you get your fertile window, which is just before ovulation. Can
But I think it's
calculate
cool
that
that some of
based
these
on.
things are becoming, it's interesting to see some of the science and the data be able to help people to do things more naturally. So it's kind of
Yeah.
interesting. So I did want to,
Yeah.
before we move
Yeah.
on to a little bit of the hormone repair manual, I do want to just,
Yeah.
what is it in the pill, the consequences that someone would have to just consider? It's obviously it's everyone's choice, but hormonal birth control that they could have to deal with 5 years, 10 years, or even as they approach perimenopausal years. Is there any downstream effects that could impact them later in life by making that choice? Like, what is the main, if you're not naturally cycling and going through that hormonal cycle, what is the real consequence of that? What is the
Yeah.
real,
Well, we're still to figure that out because that actually hasn't really been measured. Like, we've been measuring, the pill's been sort of monitored. Like, is it what kind of more immediate side effects, or is it, increasing the risk of death while women are taking it, like that sort of thing? Like, we've had that sort of data, but not a lot of people have been asking the question, like, what does this mean way into post-menopause? Like, if you spent 20 years on the pill compared to women who didn't do that. So there's a great quote from, I mentioned her earlier, reproductive endocrinologist, Professor Jaelyn Pryor. I've quoted it so many times. Let's hope I can still get it word for word. She's like, women benefit from 35 to 40 years of natural ovulatory menstrual cycles, as in making both estradiol and progesterone, not only for fertility, but also for the long-term prevention of osteoporosis, heart disease, dementia, and breast cancer. So this is from, I talk about this a little bit in the book. This is from that monthly dose of our two main hormones, ovarian hormones, estradiol and progesterone, building metabolic reserve, building bone health. Like we do here, for example, we do know that young women who take the pill do not achieve peak bone density. So we know that. As in terms of what that's going to mean when they're 80, we don't know that yet because that hasn't really happened. Because actually, we never used to have teenagers taking the pill. I mean, the pill's been around for 70 years, but at first it was really just for women, in their 20s and 30s to take it between babies. You weren't putting 11-year-olds on it. So that cohort hasn't even,
well, that seems
we're going to
common
have
these
to,
days. They do
yeah, well,
something
we're going to have to see,
and they start giving it to 6-year-olds and 10-year-olds. It's,
yeah. So, and to be clear, I mean, if people are hearing me talk about that, monthly dose of estradiol and progesterone that we need, like, to be clear, those hormones are not in hormonal birth control. Those are different molecules. They're different medications. And the progestins that are sometimes called progesterone, but are not, that are in hormonal birth control simply do not have the same effects on the brain or the bones or the cardiovascular system or the breasts that progesterone does. Professor Pryor has made the case a few times that she feels like progesterone helps shelter the breast from breast cancer, that, whereas all progestins potentially slightly increase the risk. So in answer to your question, like what are the long-term effects? Short answer, we don't know. Longer answer, through my lens, I think we're in a big mess, basically. I think, it was an experiment and a mistake to think we could routinely switch off the hormones of generations of women and think that's fine. Like, I don't think it's fine, but I guess time will tell. Yeah.
I'm sure you deal with a lot of kickback on that viewpoint,
There
but
used to be more. So when my first book came out, just before that book, because I've been, talking about this for 25 years, you were not allowed on Twitter in the early days to say that the pill could increase the risk of depression. That was just not permitted, basically. You get slammed down for that at all. And now most experts are like, yeah, that's what the data shows. We know that. And there's quite a bit of movement in that regard. There's now scientists like Sarah Hill, who's, I've met a couple times, who's researching the effect of contraceptive medication on the brain and kind of going, why has nobody looked at this before? Not to spend the whole interview talking about the pill, but there was this research out of Canadian research, not from Geraldine Pryor, but from somebody else, showing that women who took the pill as a teenager or combined method of contraception as a teenager went on to have a 3 times higher likelihood of depression later in life, even once they weren't taking the pill anymore. So it wasn't just a medication side effect while you're taking it. It's like the scientists say, well, they do acknowledge it's correlation, not causation, but they say like it makes sense, right? Like, because the brain is calibrated by hormones, especially during puberty. So if you've removed the hormones that are supposed to be there and you've put in place medications that are kind of hormone like, but really have quite a lot of different effects, then the brain is potentially going to be different.
Well, I want to use that to move on to, and we don't have to spend too much
Yeah.
time on it,
No,
but
fair enough.
I
Yeah.
want to talk about actually, because it comes up and it's a lot of the women I deal with and a lot of, these are friends, these are people I work with in our gyms.
Yeah.
You kind of talk about how perimenopause, here's how I deal with it. People come up
Yeah.
to like, I don't feel like myself. I don't know what the hell's going on with me. And it's funny how every single woman does think it's like this random thing out of nowhere, and they're not really aware
Yeah.
of perimenopausal symptoms that come on. But the thing that I like about
Yeah.
how you talk about it and your bedside manner, even with it, is that it's talked about a lot like it's a disease to be fixed. And you
Yeah.
kind of emphasize that this is very normal. It's actually a big part of evolution and then why we make it so long in life. And it's
Yeah.
not treated like a disease. Obviously, there's healthy levels and ranges and symptoms to experience. But could you talk about that a little bit and what perimenopause
Yeah.
is and really that
Well,
age of life?
so this is the second time in the interview that I get to, the fact that was an evolutionary biologist comes into play. I mean, I think once an evolutionary biologist, always an evolutionary biologist. You can't
Yeah.
undo that. Like, you can't unsee it once it's kind of there. So yeah, menopause, there's this narrative out there which I hate, which is that, menopause is an accident of living too long in the modern age. That is incorrect. So um if people want like a deep dive into that, there's a book called The Slow Moon Climbs, which I reference in my book, where she brings in all the lines of evidence to demonstrate that humans have been going through into menopause for a long time, like ever since we were human. So at least a few 100,000 years. Hard to know how far that goes back. Of course, a lot of people never used to make it that to that age. That's true just across the board. I mean, it used to be 200 years ago that 50% of kids under 5 didn't make it. So, there's obviously, in terms of life expectancy, we have on average, much longer life expectancy now. But that's not because all women used to die at just magically die at 45. It's like if you could get through childhood, get through childbirth, get through adulthood and not die of an infection, which is what most people in modern day hunter gatherer, yeah, those are the hazards. Women were living into their 70s or 80s. That's in the fossil record now. That's so what in that book, The Slow Moon Climbs, Susan Matern makes the case that I just love it. Actually, once I read that, I just couldn't unsee that. She makes the case that humans of both sexes evolved a longer human lifespan because of positive selection pressure on women in the post-reproductive years. Basically, it's so beneficial to have 60, 50, 60-year-old, even 70-year-old women around for the whole group, that the genes that let them do that, we're going to be selected for, because we just know this from modern day hunter-gatherer people, forager people. Like, the women in that age group get so much done, and they still do in our society too. Like, they're just moving and shaking and like holding life together, basically, in the case, like gathering more food than any other age group and like sharing it all. So yeah.
There's an evolutionary book that I read. The book was actually about fire, but the whole thing, I think it
Yeah.
brought up, it might have been the term like grandmothering and
Yeah.
talking about the role in these hunter-gatherer and, evolutionary
Yeah.
societies that allowed even like men to go take risk to hunt meat because
Yeah.
people can play
Yeah.
different roles in society to make sure there was substance and food to take care
Yeah.
of the children. Women could take more risks and do other things, and it allowed a family dynamic to truly kind of take hold and really everyone maximize the family dynamic.
Well, we could spend a whole hour talking about this, which we won't, but I will just share. Yeah. Like humans, just the nature of like how long childhood is, how dangerous childbirth is, like just those few factors. Um, like, unlike some animals where a female can just raise her own babies, that is just not the case for humans. You need what are called alloparents. So you need all these essentially kind of non-reproducing, adults in the group to hold it all together. as you say, like allow men to go out and take risks, allow younger women to have, a baby every 3 years. If that's what she's physically able to do, she needs so much support. And some of that is coming from the 50, 60-year-old women who are, yeah, just holding it all together for everybody else. So, through that lens, yes, we evolved to do this. Menopause is not an accident. The fact that it's symptomatic for so many of us in our modern world, I make the case in my book, I would say that is pretty much 100% what's called evolutionary mismatch. So it's not meant to be symptomatic, just like periods are not meant to be symptomatic, but they often are. But, in our world, I mean, there's just so much wrong with the modern world and the modern food supply and environmental toxins. And there's just the microbiome, like things have gone off the rails. And that is affecting human physiology in lots of general ways, but specifically it's making periods harder, it's making perimenopause harder, it's making what should have just been just a transition into a symptomatic transition. So as we know from, and this is not just me saying this, like we know from the data that women in other cultures, including modern day forager people like the Hadza in Tanzania, like they go through menopause, they know about it, they know women stop having periods at 45, and they're like happy about it. Like it's not a symptomatic time. It's like, this is good. You just get to stop having periods and stop having babies, and you get to now do other stuff. And well, probably a lot of work still, but it's not it's not a disease state. Although because of evolutionary mismatch, it can, yeah, cause a lot of symptoms, and it can increase for sure. Perimenopause, transition to menopause, increases the risk of insulin resistance, which could lead us to the next book. I guess this is a big part of what's happening for women. And some researchers call it the metabolic upheaval of perimenopause, menopause. Metabolism changes a lot, and that's part of the symptom picture, not the whole explanation for the symptoms, but
Yeah,
part of it.
I think part of the thing that's hard with me working with people as a nutrition person is I can help someone control their nutritional components. That's actually why I like nutrition so much. It's very simple. It's
Yeah.
an input. You can get
Yep.
an output from it. But as you know, there's sleep, there's the health of a marriage, the relationship, there's
Yeah.
isolation, there's the being compared to everyone in the world, there's the chemicals, there's the microbiome, there's the
Yeah.
processed food, there's an
Yep.
excess work life, you're trying to overwork out to balance out your bad eating or your stress life, then that may be adding more stress, and you're trying to
Yep.
fix all these moving parts for someone that they're trying to do the best they can, but you can see why a lot of the symptoms that whether it's a woman or a man in different areas of life, you could see why there's so many variables that are out of whack that are contributing to this.
Yeah. One of the ways I come at it, just I think I say something similar in the book, but I'll just kind of put it in slightly different words here, because it's a very complex system. Like, so someone on my social media the other day just commented on me writing a book on metabolism. She's like, "Oh, so many twists and turns with metabolism." I'm like, "It's true. Like, there's so many moving parts." And that can be quite overwhelming. And certainly for people listening, they may think, well, I can't control every moving part. Like obviously you can't, like, I'm just saying to people, you don't have to learn about all those moving parts and micromanage everyone, because that would just be impossible. I mean, my book does contain some detail about the physiology, just mainly for people who are interested. But for people who just want that, bird's eye view of zoomed way out, I'll just say it's a very complex system. It's an ecosystem, basically. And so I guess what I sort of encourage people to do is, in the book, I use the phrase embrace the complexity. I would say here, just surrender to the complexity and just understand that because of that complexity, attempts to micromanage are potentially going to be frustrating. Like, you're not, you might think, well, I've made this change, why am I not seeing changes on the scale? It's like, well, there's so much at play. So, I take a different approach, which is obviously start with getting what you need, which is all based in the book. I talk about the fact that you're an animal, like a biological creature that has all these requirements. Most of them are not complicated, but they're things that, are non-negotiable. I make the analogy of, like, for anyone who's looked after children or, animals, it's like, you can't just decide, well, they don't need, cuddling, or they don't need a walk, or they don't need the food that's right for them. Like, they need all those things. And then the next step with embracing the complexity or leaning into it is surrendering to it, is just the next step. If you've done all of that, like if you're confident you're getting what you need, and you're still not making progress, then it's because something is standing in the way. So then there does have to be some troubleshooting then to think, well, what is, back to what I said at the beginning, like fix your health and you'll fix your metabolism. So if it's a digestion problem, that has to be addressed. If you're on a medication, including something like hormonal birth control, that's impairing your metabolic health, that actually needs to be addressed. Or if you've got food sensitivities, or if you've, yeah. So I hope that makes it, helps to simplify it in a sort of more practical way than just trying to do some arithmetic around calories in, calories out. Because I'm sorry, that just doesn't. It might work for some people, but I think the people it works for are a unique, certain kind of person who, has.
No, and I think a big part about your book is building a healthy relationship with food and yourself,
Yeah,
your body, and all of that stuff. So I think some of the things you do talk about in your book, I mean, you get into some nerdy stuff, which I loved. You talk a lot about the mitochondria. You brought up some other
yeah,
great brain energy, I believe you mentioned,
yeah,
and all that goes into that. I thought the science in that was awesome. I love reading that type of
yeah,
stuff. But I think if we
yeah,
were to go high level, I think some of the things that
yeah,
you really focus on and what drew me to reach out to you even was I
yeah,
found it refreshing for a female, doctor or naturopath doctor,
yeah,
influencer, to actually say what I think so many women are just wrapped up in not saying, which is it's okay to eat some animal meat. It's okay to have,
yeah.
it doesn't mean they have to, doesn't mean they have to, but I feel like for so long, there's a typical cliche thing. And I think that misguides people a lot because it's easy to eat a lot of plant-based foods that are heavily processed and sugar and seed oils and chemicals and all these different things. So I feel like focusing on real foods, having a little protein, and then your biggest topic in the book is really addressing insulin resistance, I feel like, which you see as a
Yeah.
big part of that metabolic flexibility and reestablishing our health.
Well, the book's primarily about insulin resistance. And then all the other stuff is, how to reverse that and restore good insulin sensitivity, which is our birthright. I will just touch on it's interesting actually. I'd love to hear some sociologists kind of dissect where this, stereotype that you're kind of describing that many meet and women don't, like from a biology perspective, that makes zero sense at all. It actually would be the female of the species that would be more needing the nutrient dense animal foods, actually, I would say. And actually, my experience is, well, this is a very broad observation. So, probably, I don't know, I don't want you to get pushed back on this, but like I would say, of the people who can or seemingly can get away with a plant based diet longer term, it's usually men. I think women crash at some point, and I think it's just because we have higher nutritional needs. Basically, it's just harder to like have a reproductive female, even if you're not having babies. Just having cycles, it's just we just need more, and so yeah, I don't know. It's unfortunate. I think maybe that came from women are quite empathetic and concerned about other lives, and so that's an understandable reason why women maybe are more in the group that don't want to eat other animals. But
Do you feel
yeah,
some of it's societal pressure that comes from marketing?
I
Like
don't
that
know
comes
where it's
from,
all coming. Yeah, and I with this book, you'll see I didn't really hold back. Like, okay, put it this way. So I think there's a huge like variety in terms of macronutrient ratio and like what people are doing. So I definitely don't think, everyone needs to, you know, only eat like there's no one size fits all. So
right,
some people
right.
can do quite well. Some people could do quite well with a lot of like maybe mostly plant-based, but like some animal food, which is actually quite similar to some of the supposedly, longer lived societies in the world.
Yeah.
Although I don't know
Now,
if you know, but the whole blue zone thing is all in question as to whether that's
yeah,
even
I
a
know.
thing or just a statistical anomaly, which is quite interesting. So I don't endorse the whole blue zone side of things, but I'll acknowledge there are traditional peoples who eat a lot of plant foods and eat some animal foods with that. And then there are traditional peoples who eat tons of animal foods, and like it just varies. And so that makes sense that that's going to vary now. But I do make I do feel this as a biologist through my biologist lens. There are certain nutrients really only available from animal foods that are non-negotiables. So, and a lot of them are stored. So there will be a honeymoon phase. So I think people can get through, I'd say it's 18 months is average. People can get through kind of 18 months exclusively plant-based. They might feel quite good, actually, especially if they've come off dairy, because as I talked about earlier, dairy can be quite inflammatory. But then at some point they'll hit a wall. And I've seen that with my patients. I just had a patient a couple of weeks ago. I described like this crash, like a couple of years in, her immune system is crashing and her periods are off the rails. And, she's just like, I'm going to have to start bringing eggs back or fish. I'm just going to have to. And like, she knows at some level that's true. And that's just a common experience. I know maybe there's outliers that hasn't been their experience, but I just being realistic about it, I just feel like people need some of those key nutrients.
I think a key part is that the societies that they're looking at people that had large amounts of plant or even carbohydrate type foods, they were eating such a different type of carbohydrate and a different type of plant-based food than what the common person is doing now when they try to go plant-based. So I feel like they're missing a lot of the wisdom that traditional societies had. Obviously, like you said, there's societies that are mostly plant-based, but even those societies, a lot of them, when you look at them, worshiped the meat when they were able to get it. Like the Okinawa.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The Okinawans worshipped when they got meat and they thought it was the key to their longevity. But if you read the book, the authors actually are like, but they'd be better if they didn't eat the pork. And I'm just like, okay, let's just dismiss the wisdom of this entire society and what they believe because it's not in the food pyramid or something.
Not to spend too much time on this, but there are zero traditional societies who ate no animal products because it's so crucial for fertility. I just don't think people like societies that were eating zero animal products could have kept reproducing for generations.
I didn't know that.
That's why we don't have them.
I didn't know that actually. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So let's get into the main part of the insulin resistance. And specifically now I want to tell you, we have a nutrition program. It is lower carb, mainly because we feel like you said in your book, it's not that everyone should be low carb or even should be at all. But when you're talking about those things, you're talking about addressing a specific thing, not just metabolically flexible and healthy. Someone who's healthy and metabolically flexible can do totally different things than someone who maybe needs to fix a condition. So that is our main thing in our program that we do is trying to fix that issue. So that's why I love your book so much. That's why your book aligns with us so much. So what is high level? What are the things? What is insulin resistance? I'd love to hear you explain what it is and how can that impact a woman?
Good question. It seems like a very basic question. And believe me, you asked
it's a lot.
No, it's like, well, you know what I mean? Like, depending on, it seems like it should be a fairly straightforward. Okay, here's how I'm phrasing it these days. Insulin resistance is a hormonal condition, basically. Like, so step one, it's a hormonal condition. I think maybe people that kind of puts it in the right framework. It is a situation of certain cells in the body not being able to respond to insulin properly. But a main feature of insulin resistance is the chronically elevated insulin. So the hormone insulin is chronically high. And that does lots of things. But one of the things it does is impairs fat burning. And not only as in impairs your ability to lose your body fat, but actually to liberate your body fat for energy for your cells. So, people get locked into carb burning, which means they run out of carbs or they, get low blood sugar and they have to, they have to eat more just to kind of get through the afternoon. I think being locked in carb burning is a way to describe it. And that is not the normal state. Like as humans, our normal state is supposed to be fat burning, which I think is just a really important detail. Like our normal fasting, resting state. So, starting from, 3 or 4 hours after a meal, you're no longer just burning what was in the meal, but like you're dipping it. Yeah, you're burning glycogen as well, but actually most of the cells prefer to be burning fat. So that is our birthright. That's how we're supposed to function. And so many people, because insulin resistance is so common that a lot of people are locked in this carb burning. And so it is important to understand because a moment for me was when I was talking about insulin resistance on social media. And because it's synonym to some extent as pre-diabetes, which is actually unfortunate. I'm going to stop using that term because that immediately implies that it's associated with high blood sugar. And I had someone on social media say, oh, well, I get low blood sugar sometimes. So I must not have insulin resistance. I must have the opposite of insulin resistance. It's like, no, like a tendency to low blood sugar is one of the main symptoms of insulin resistance. So that's like really crucial. And feeling hungry all the time is one of the main symptoms of insulin resistance. So other signs and symptoms would be, I'll just run through them because people it's not that hard to figure out if you've got it. Like this, like I have all of chapter 5 is about it, but like you can, it's a type. Okay, and to be fair, you can have quite a small, relatively small body size and still have insulin resistance. So you can't just go by BMI for sure, but there is a type of fat accumulation. We talked about it earlier, which is the visceral fat, which I'll just describe it like for people listening. Like it's not the squishy, it's not the like on your belly, like I'm just squishing my own like roll on my belly right now. Like it's not that. It's like under the rib cage. It's this hard like shelf almost of like people, women know it's not right. They're like, this doesn't feel, this like is uncomfortable. Like you know, you can, that's hypertrophied visceral fat. That's very much associated with insulin resistance. Is it both caused by and probably promotes or drives or worsens insulin resistance? That's also associated with fatty liver, which if anyone's, the doctors mention fatty liver, that is almost for sure insulin resistance, barring, you know, a few other potential causes, but by far most cases it's insulin resistance. High triglycerides, high cholesterol, high something called ALT that's associated with fatty liver. That's, I just mention it because ALT will be on the normal blood report that you get from the doctor. You don't have to pay extra money to have a fancy test done. It's right there. High blood pressure. Yeah, those are some of the main signs and symptoms. And all of the thing to know about insulin resistance, it's reversible. And I'll just agree with you what you said earlier. The debate about, you know, what are some of the dietary strategies for reversing insulin resistance? That's a totally different conversation than what did people traditionally eat. Like you're like exactly like you just said, like people with good insulin sensitivity, with good metabolic flexibility ate a whole range of, and some people ate mostly carbohydrate dominant diets. That doesn't mean, that's totally separate conversation from whether, you know, some amount of carb restriction can reverse insulin resistance, because the answer is it can, like in combination with lots of other strategies, but that's very clear in the research now. So I think,
And
yeah,
something I want to touch on that you said about the insulin being elevated and a symptom
yeah,
being you dip into low blood sugar and things like that is because the insulin, this is why I always tell people to get a fasting insulin test, is because your glucose
yeah,
could be normal for decades, but your
yes,
insulin could be elevated for decades because your insulin is
yes,
just juggling it all, trying to keep it in check. And that's why the insulin number is so much more important, because your glucose could look normal for kind of a while. And that's why you are
totally,
insulin resistant. The insulin's high, but the blood sugar is normal. And I think you point that out in the book.
exactly. Yeah, and it's really crucial. And your HbA1c could be normal too. That's another blood sugar reading. So I guess because I've had right in the introduction of the book, I talk about how like probably hundreds of conversations with patients where I'm like, I think, you know, I'm concerned you have insulin resistance. And I'm like, oh no, my doctor tested my insulin. It's fine. I'm like, really? Because, you know, I'd be surprised. And then it's like, oh no, their blood glucose is fine. It's like, that's not. So yes, you can measure the hormone insulin. I will just say, like, fortunately, I do talk about it in the book. It's not a perfect test. I wish if I do fasting insulin quite a lot. I do order that for patients. Put it this way: if your fasting insulin is high, that is insulin resistance. If it's low, if it's normal or low, you unfortunately don't necessarily know. You'd have to put it in the context of some of the other signs and symptoms that I talked about. There is a test called HOMA IR index, which is where they measure a few fasting insulins, and they do a ratio with glucose, and that seems a little more reliable. It's actually just because insulin, it's a hormone, so it's actually going up and down. I think it's every 90 minutes. A lot of hormones are on this 90-minute cycle, so it's kind of going up and down. It responds quite quickly to as soon as anyone's had like a few very active days of exercise or has already been restricting carbohydrates, their insulin will come down. And it doesn't rule out that that's actually been their main, or probably still is their main problem. It's just, I hope that makes sense. I just don't want people out there
How
thinking, oh, my fasting insulin's low, so therefore I'm fine, but not necessarily. Yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
feel about, because a lot of times people just get, like you said, they just take the typical blood work, so they're not getting some of these
Yeah.
other tests. How do you feel about triglycerides and HDL as a proxy for
Yeah.
insulin sensitivity?
Yeah. So those, yeah, that can be helpful. So, you know, high triglycerides is a very good single proxy. So I always have to convert to American units.
Oh yeah.
So, in terms of triglycerides. So, you know, a cutoff would be, I think it should be below 150
Yep.
milligrams per
That's
deciliter.
your,
Does that sound
yeah.
about right? Yeah. And in Australia and New Zealand, or in Australia, that's 1.7 millimoles per liter. So depending on where your audience is, they can Yeah. So that's yeah, that's a really important. And to understand, I mean, triglycerides are fat. So it's sort of been this misunderstanding that, fat increases triglycerides. Actually, the biggest thing that increases triglycerides is insulin resistance, potentially fructose, carbohydrates in the diet, potentially. And so in a way, I have one quote from one of the experts saying, really, the higher the triglycerides on a blood test, the probably lower carbohydrate you should go. You know, again, in context with all the
Mention
other
that in your book.
strategies. Yeah, yeah, it's quite a good proxy. Yeah.
So same
Mhm.
same point, and then we can move on from that. But you said
Yeah,
liver earlier, and I think sometimes
yeah,
people, but fatty liver is often brought on by fructose, alcohol, high
yeah,
carbohydrate, processed carbohydrate consumption. Um,
yeah.
because
Well, it's part of the insulin resistance process. So it both is caused by insulin resistance, promotes insulin resistance, can really destabilize. I was just reading a pretty fascinating sort of Twitter thread kind of article by Chris Masterjohn. I don't know if you follow his
yeah,
stuff's super technical and detailed, but like he made the point, I'd never really heard this before, that one of the problems potentially with fatty liver, I mean, I'd have to fact check this, but it's interesting. Like it squishes, like it's physically like squishing the fat cells. Like it's just taking up space. There's all that fat in the liver and it's preventing glycogen stores. So people are just not getting, the
hmm,
normal kind of glycogen supply, which is intriguing. I was like, well, that's one mechanism that it's by which it's making life hard. Obviously, fatty liver can then progress to liver damage, and um, fatty liver is really important. I am going to be talking about it more, I think, in my content because it affects. I mean, a conservative estimate is that fatty liver affects 30% of menopausal women. So it might be 40. It's getting up there, and it's reversible as well. So that's the other good news. Yeah.
so is there anything directly that you can say about insulin resistance? How you directly know how it impacts women beyond just it is obviously a hormonal issue that can affect weight, how we feel, hunger, all those things. But is there anything else inflammatory or anything specifically related to women that it is impacting?
Well, for sure, PCOS. So we've talked about that a little bit. So polycystic. So insulin resistance is a major feature of PCOS, major driver, as I would call it. And if you reverse insulin resistance, a lot of the times you can pull out of a PCOS state and reverse the symptoms. It also the shift to insulin resistance, I would say. So just to put it, we talked about perimenopause and how perimenopause itself, that transition, that second puberty, should not specifically be symptomatic, but there's lots of reasons because of evolutionary mismatch why that is symptomatic. One of those reasons, one of the part of the evolutionary mismatch is insulin resistance. So with as estrogen drops, we lose its kind of superpowers in terms of sheltering or protecting women from insulin resistance. Put it this way, the mitochondria, well, we haven't really talked about them yet, but they love estrogen. They just love it. And it sort of would normally, through that mechanism and some other mechanisms, estrogen protects young women from insulin resistance to some extent. And then when we lose that, we're changed gears metabolically, where we're just going to have to start relying more on fat for energy. And to put it in perspective, our ancient ancestors would have done that seamlessly. It would have been like they didn't have insulin resistance. Like there was no problem for them. Like their increased risk of insulin resistance because of losing estrogen didn't manifest because they lived in such a like their food environment was so good and they were so active and just wasn't an issue at all. But for us, it is. And in terms, as to your question, like how does that manifest? Well, once you move into insulin resistance into later in the phases of perimenopause and into menopause, that directly can cause a brain energy crisis. So that means the body's less able to kind of mobilize fat and potentially make the ketones it needs to support brain energy. The brain's less able to use the glucose it needs for energy. So there's a researcher, Roberta Brinton, who coined the term the brain energy crisis of menopause. That's primarily because of insulin resistance. It causes not only symptoms like brain fog and cognition symptoms, but also potentially migraines, but also increases the long-term risk of dementia, which is harsh and sad and depressing. That the dementia risk can increase with menopause. It doesn't have to. I think if there's like most women, as even Roberta Brinton says, most women through the transition, their brain kind of metabolism, their energy system kind of recalibrates, and the brain's like, right, I can, get energy other ways and sort of get used to having reduced insulin sensitivity. But long term, it can lead not only to dementia, but also obviously heart disease, cardiovascular. So this is where, in answer to your question, like for women specifically, people probably know the statistic that young women have a reduced risk of heart disease, and then with menopause, women pop right up to like the same risk as men. So that's a big part of that, insulin resistance.
Is there any contribution if you become insulin resistant, then you start to put on fat at a higher rate than you naturally would? Obviously, a woman
Yeah.
will naturally have more fat for a lot of reasons, even hormonal reasons that benefit, in supporting
Yeah.
life and all of these things. But where you can get into an estrogen dominant state with excess fat, because doesn't fat in and of itself create
Yeah.
thin and
Yes.
other things?
Okay. Oh
And then
yeah. I
fat
mean,
gets fat and estrogen can create estrogen.
okay. So let's talk a little bit about estrogen and fat. So estradiol, our main ovarian estrogen, promotes lower body bum fat. Well, it promotes subcutaneous fat in general. Bum fat is it's really quite different from the visceral fat we've been talking about. Bum fat is not correlated with insulin resistance. Bum fat is, well, it's from estrogen, it's to a large extent genetic, like how much women have. Like women really vary in terms of how much bum or gynoid fat we store.
Okay.
So that's where, on the one hand, it can be true that yes, estrogen promotes fat gain. That's true, especially for lower body subcutaneous bum fat. But then losing estrogen, switching to more the kind of testosterone dominance that I call it of perimenopause, where testosterone starts to shine through more, you get more that fat redistribution to android or visceral fat. That is really quite dangerous and is like what all part of the insulin resistance picture. Like that's actually, it's quite inflammatory. It's, part of kind of what's promoting fatty liver. So, and then yes, it's visceral fat does make another it does make another estrogen called estrone or E1, which seems to be and I think the research is just trying to catch up with all of this, but estrone is not estrone is not estradiol. So estrone does not seem to be friendly metabolically the way estradiol is. It's potentially quite unfriendly to breasts, for example, as well. So this, you don't necessarily want that estrogen coming from visceral fat. That's not an ideal type of estrogen to be making. So, I have heard the argument that, women gain weight in the middle, around the middle, to kind of as a source of estrogen. I don't really buy that. I don't think it's that simple. I think we'll put it this way. You have to sort of look at what's happening again back, like the Hadza or modern day forager people. They're not getting that, huge amount of visceral fat gain. So and yet they're doing well in their menopausal years. So that's not a good kind of estrogen production. No, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So then there's one question I have dietary wise, because you touch on it.
Okay.
Low carb can be okay for
Yes,
address if someone needs healing as a therapeutic approach.
for sure.
When do you see low carb be a negative to women? And what state? And does that have anything to do with the stress response, the HPA axis, things like that? Where does it cross over where it goes from therapeutic and healing to where it can become a stressor or a detriment to someone? And people that you've worked with, when have you noticed that this low carb approach isn't working for you? We need to shift, or it doesn't work for this type of person.
Yeah, great question. So yes, so just as a starting position, I do think low carb can be suitable for some women. I do. Like, and as to how long they do it, or if they, carb cycle a bit or on and off, or, there's just all different variables, I think. And certainly a low carb or keto diet can be beneficial for other things too. Like we know that now from like, inflammatory bowel disease and sort of migraines. And there's a whole, so I want to just acknowledge the complexity of the low carb space and all the different things going on in there. But in answer to your question, when is it a problem? Well, the handy thing is women, we have a barometer of health. We have our periods, our monthly, menstrual cycles to tell us if something's off. So even earlier in our conversation today, we talked about a common reason for young women to stop ovulating, stop having regular ovulations and periods is undereating, and specifically undereating carbs. I think I talked about how, that seems to be sort of something genetic. So I think, depending on ancestry, some women are just calibrated to need more carbohydrates to convince their brain to have a regular period. It's going to be, my experience is it's more women losing their periods to low carb is there seems to be a genetic component, and it's age related too. So young women are just more likely to lose their period, full stop, basically. I think just because, yeah, by young, I mean maybe under 30, women certainly under 25, like their brain ovary calibration is just a little more cautious. It's like, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's going on here. So they will, and so I guess for any trainers or people or women, listening, if you've been doing something like a dietary intervention, whether it's low calorie, which I'm not a fan of, or low carb, and your period goes missing, yeah, like whoa, the horses, like apply the brake, pump the brakes, and think about what is going on here. And if in doubt, really bring back carbs. And again, it won't be instant. Like you can't like bring back carbs for a couple weeks and get a period. Like you'd have to do it for 6 months potentially to
I
recover. And yeah,
I have
yeah,
noticed the troubles in coaching with people with carbs that I've noticed is sometimes I will notice they go low carb, that they will either not ovulate or have changes to their cycle, but then it almost like quickly calibrates. I almost think it's like what you said, like the
sure.
body's like, hey, what's going on here? But then the real time I've noticed it is that it being a detriment is if people chronically, like you said, they get into this place where it worked for them to lose weight, to feel
Right.
great, reduce the bloating, fix all these other issues for them,
Yeah.
but they never get out of the controlling how much they're eating and controlling the carbohydrates. And they may even pair that up with excess extreme exercise and stress. And eventually it breaks them down months later down the road because they stayed in that state too long rather than shifting into a place of fully nourishing and getting back to it, not just addressing what they were initially trying to heal.
I think you bring up a couple good points. I'll just say a lot of reason this is true with my patients. I have had a lot of women come to me who are avoiding carbs, not for weight, but for digestion. So that's actually, there's a low FODMAP diet is a low carb diet. So yeah, there is, and I think weirdly, but I mean, just to be clear, I think one of the mechanisms by which a low carb diet can improve insulin sensitivity is by fixing the gut. So, certainly low carb is an intervention for gut, but there's other ways to have a healthier gut. So yes, and I think you're right. Like I think if someone changes their diet, gets a wobble with their ovulations, but it kind of then goes back to normal, that's fine. Then that's fine. Like a little temporary wobble or a couple cycles that are later or something, that's not anything to worry about. Like, and a primary feature is just enough calories coming in. So low
Yep.
carb tends to be appetite suppressing. So women, I think, are just in danger of under eating generally. But as long as they're getting like actual calories coming in, they're probably okay. And then the other thing to say is, I mean, well, obviously, low carb can be for lots of different reasons, but what we're talking about really here is low carb is an intervention for insulin resistance. So that's why it's important to not guess and actually know if there is insulin resistance, because another side of it, you might get a young woman with PCOS who she's lost her periods due to PCOS and insulin resistance. So then in her case, low carb can bring back her periods. So, I mean, I certainly, when I've talked about this online, I get people saying, oh, no, that can't be true because I went low carb and I got my periods became more regular. It's like, yeah, it depends on your starting place. So you don't want to just be guessing. And one of the things about PCOS, so much detail in all of these conversations, but this is worth mentioning. There's a big problem with assessment and diagnosis of PCOS right now. It's actually just a complete mess. And so you get, if, and I talk about this in all my books actually. So if the doctor is too reliant on the ultrasound finding of polycystic ovary syndrome, or polycystic ovaries is kind of, they're not even cysts, actually, to be clear. They're just like the number of follicles or eggs that are visible. If the diagnosis is too hinged on that without like considering whether elevated testosterone is even present or kind of what's actually happening, then you do get, it's like, and this has been confirmed in the science, you get women with hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is having lost their period to undereating or undereating carbs, being mistakenly told they have PCOS because they happen to have polycystic ovaries, which is extremely common with hypothalamic amenorrhea. And then they're like, oh, I have PCOS, but no one's confirmed insulin resistance. And then they're like, well, I must have to do low carbs. This is a person, this is like no joke. I've had 50 conversations with women like this where they've already lost their period to going too low carb for whatever reason. And then they're told PCOS and then they go even lower. Or like, then they're actually they're moving in the completely opposite direction to where they would need to go to get their period back. So I always try to bring that example online because it's guaranteed there's someone listening who that's happened to. So hopefully they can get some guidance and turn that around.
So I want to wrap up because I don't want to hold you much
Okay.
longer. I've had you so long here on just things for people to consider that could make an impact, a difference. Um, Specifically, you do mention some different supplements or foods that
Yeah.
include certain nutrients. When it comes
Yeah.
to working with women, once again, everyone's different. There's all this individuality, but there's
Yeah.
always common issues. Specifically with when it comes to nutrients that women may be missing, what do you look helps them the most? You did mention zinc earlier. Is there anything else that you think is worthwhile? I'm normally not a high supplement person unless they're in a deficient state. What do you normally, what's a go-to that's a common issue that supplements can help with?
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to be kind of brief here. I'll just say the problem with, I would agree in theory, like unless there's a deficient state, you shouldn't need to supplement. But how do we determine a deficient state, right? Like for most nutrients, there's no blood test. Not really. I mean, there's some functional testing that tries to look at some of it, but iron can be tested for sure. I mean, zinc maybe, although zinc blood tests are not that accurate. The nutrients, the problem is our modern food supply, in addition to its many other issues, including, additives, emulsifiers, fructose, vegetable oils. Like we can leave that for another topic for another day. Like, there's the modern food supply has got some weird things going on. And one of the things is it's much less nutrient dense than people were eating even 70 years ago. And that would, like, just give a case in point. I don't think I've brought this example up with you yet, but I was a kid in the 70s and we had, my parents would laugh if they knew I was giving this example every interview, but like we had liver every week. That was like on the menu, right? Like it was like that's just like on the rotation. Like you have like roast chicken and then you have like liver and onions and you just like, and so that was, organ meats are incredibly nutrient dense. They're a source of a couple of the nutrients that I'm about to list, which I call the missing metabolic nutrients. And so we've just gone in 2 generations from that being part of the diet to that being gone for most people. I mean, there might be some people listening who eat liver every week, but it's not a, I don't in my house anymore. Although I keep trying to talk myself back into it, but it's like, do you cook liver? Mark, I'm curious. Is that no?
No, I've tried so many times and I'll be real,
Okay.
I can't get it
Okay.
down.
Yeah. The modern
I
palate
want to
just
so bad.
won't.
I'm so like Weston A. Price and a lot of
I
things.
know.
So
Yeah.
caveman diets has influenced
Yeah.
paleo things and evolutionary stuff. I
You
can't
can't
get,
even mix it in. Like some people mix for their kids, like they mix it in with like
yeah.
meatloaf or something. Like,
I want to be
anyway,
that guy, but I'd be lying. I can't.
you're not, you want to be that guy, but you're not that guy. So, in answer to your question, like, what are we deficient in? A lot, actually, I think,
Right.
compared to our fairly recent ancestors, which is probably part of the problem. But the 5 missing metabolic nutrients, which you can't test for, which I talk about in the book, is magnesium. That's not an organ meat one, actually. That's just, you get that. That's just low in the soils and from food processing and different things. But magnesium is mainly a plant-based nutrient. So there you go. The plant-based people will be happy with me for that one. So magnesium, the amino acid taurine, which is just, I got incredible research behind it. I just tweeted a study about how it appears that taurine actually reverses metabolic syndrome. It's like, yeah, it appears that it does. Huh? So taurine,
What food would
then
taurine be high in? Is there any?
meat. This, yeah. Muscle meats as well. So any kind of animal product, seafood, things like that.
Okay.
Um, choline. That's one of the organ meats. Humans probably used to eat. I might say 10 times more choline than we get now, depending on, on average,
Also
depending
high in
on it.
eggs.
Yeah, you get it in eggs. Yeah, it's high in eggs, but
And what's the importance of choline? Quickly, I don't want you don't have to go way too deep, but
it can prevent and reverse fatty liver.
okay.
And it also is the precursor to acetylcholine, which is one of our main satiety signals. So it's got a lot going on, helps with fat metabolism. It's pretty important. It's missing. So then the other one from organ meats is inositol. Our main source of inositol was probably from inositol phospholipids, which came from organ meats. We also can get it from fiber and other things like that. And we also make some of these nutrients ourselves, but in quite low doses. But our animal body 100% used to expect to get that from food, and we don't anymore. And then the 5th one, number 5 of my missing metabolic, is glycine. which I'm more and more just quite a huge fan of glycine. And again, that's you can't there is glycine in plant foods. And for anyone who's interested, I've just had a penny drop moment. Again, this was I do have to sort of credit Chris Masterjohn for kind of really explaining this to me. It was already on my radar, but like I didn't until he kind of said it in a tweet. I didn't quite get the methionine to glycine ratio is probably pretty important in terms of metabolic health and aging. And plant proteins normally have quite a high glycine to methionine just naturally, but it is possible to also eat animal foods and also just boost glycine, like by eating, glycine is in bone broth and collagen and all those parts of the animal, and also glycine you can just take. So glycine is one of my missing metabolic nutrients. I do take it. It's pretty great. Like it's a calming neurotransmitter. It shelters the liver from fructose. So yeah.
Can I tell you that it's funny when you say these things, and
Yeah.
I felt this a lot, and not as a, once again, not as a, you
Yeah.
have to only eat this way, but as a
Right.
noticing what people are missing a lot sometimes. A little bit of meat can give you a lot of
Yeah.
nutrients and go a long way. Obviously, the better the meat, the higher quality, the organ meats, things like that as well. But just
Yeah.
including things sometimes seem to be the nutrients that a lot of people are missing.
I've had and I won't name them obviously, but like I've had a few patients who were former vegans, formerly plant-based, and they decided they're going to stay mostly plant-based, but bring in organ meats. And I thought, you know what? That is actually pretty sensible. Like from their perspective, it's like, they really like lots of parts about plant-based. They knew they were missing that nutrient dense. And I think part of the thinking was, well, organs are kind of the part that nobody else is eating. So maybe it's just like a discarded part. So they're like, well, I'll eat that part and get like a huge bang for my buck, like just get this
Yeah.
massive influx of nutrients. And I'm like, that I can respect that. I'm like, yeah, I think that's going to work. I was like, as their clinician, I'm like, you know what? I
I'm on
think you could
board.
do it. Yeah. So, yeah.
So, final two questions I have as part of that supplemental thing, hormone
Yeah.
replacement. Obviously, we don't have to go too deep into it, but just what's your view on it and what's your general advisement towards it?
Few quick points. There's no question that estrogen therapy can improve or mitigate insulin resistance. Like it definitely can help with some of this, what we've been describing, the loss of estradiol. So taking the modern, what's called body identical hormone therapy has lots of pluses. And but I will say one thing, and I'm about to do I don't know when this podcast is going to come out, but I'm about to do a social media post just trying to clarify like what's going on a little bit here, because just and I discussed this in my hormone repair manual, my perimenopause book, but actually weirdly, perimenopause is a time of too high estrogen and low progesterone. And then as you move through perimenopause into the later phases, then that's when estrogen finally starts to drop. So there's a big difference between deciding if you're going to take estrogen in the later perimenopause into the postmenopause kind of years. That's quite a different conversation than whether you come on board with estrogen at 42 when your estrogen's already higher than normal. Like, there's just like there's different parts of the conversation. So, and I don't know if you're aware how combative this has got. We're talking, what are we now? We're September 2024. It's crazy out there. Like it's absolutely crazy in terms of the debate. So I would recommend, I don't know if you have tried to wade into it, but I would not. Like,
No, I go
basically,
much. I know it's going back and forth over the years, and I think I saw
like,
an interview of yours, but a lot of that hate for it was from one study that was using terrible
sure.
hormones and old hormones that don't even
Yes.
mimic the body now, whereas now it's gotten a lot better. So it seems like you're okay with it if used
But
properly.
I've always been in favor of, well, I've always been supportive of
Okay.
potentially women taking estrogen therapy. You're right. There's been a pendulum swinging. Like when I was started as a naturopathic doctor in the 90s, just to give the full spectrum, it was like rah, 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 estrogen prevents heart disease, like boom, 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 boom. That was like definitely the narrative. That was Premarin back then, which is like these old school, like hardcore hormones, which nobody uses anymore. And then there was the Women's Health Initiative study, which has been, yes, I understand, was probably misinterpreted and had lots of problems with it. But then it swung all the way to like, no one should take it. It's like too
Right.
scary. And now it's good. Like we've swung back to thinking actually it's pretty good, like in fairly low risk to like everybody must take it or they're going to get dementia. Like I tried about 2 months ago to share something about estrogen and I just got slammed. And so I don't know, I may try again on social media. I don't know. I mean, I've written a whole book on perimenopause and now I'm a supporter of estrogen therapy and I'm actually too scared to talk about it on social media now. So that's how crazy it is right now.
But you also
So,
believe only like everyone shouldn't be doing it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Not everyone should be
yeah.
doing it just because perimenopause is some disease state. You think it should only be used if you're trying to correct something that's truly out of whack relative to that age. Is that true or no?
Well, I guess oh, you'll have to bring me back for a full nuanced conversation. I think I'll just say yes, I mean the more conservative experts would say only when there's symptoms. I agree with that. I think as long as it's, safe to take. I think I would also be in the camp of, I think there's a case to be made for taking some estrogen therapy to try to mitigate this environmental mismatch that I talked about earlier. Like, I reject, just from a philosophical biological perspective, I do though reject the narrative that it's a deficiency because menopause, we were never supposed to reach menopause. It's an accident of living too long. Therefore, it's a disease that we have to take estrogen. Like I reject that, even though, and I have disclosed it on a few other podcasts. So I'll say I take estrogen therapy myself, low dose. So, I I think it's possible to hold those things in the brain at the same time. I think some amount of estrogen can help mitigate all the other things we're stacked up against in the modern world. And at the same time, I don't think it's this deficiency state that
Is there
every
an age?
woman must take.
Is there
Yep.
an age where you will go off of the estrogen or no? Is it?
Good question. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. I'm just like, I'm going to watch the science. I think that's a reasonable position for anyone to take is let's just see what scientists figure out over the coming years. And to be fair, I'm taking quite a low dose, like what I call like a fairy dusting of estrogen. I'm not like trying to replace levels I had when I was, in my reproductive years. So, and there's different philosophies about how much to take. So, and I guess just in closing on this topic, like the thing I most dislike about the narrative that menopause is a deficiency and you must take estrogen or you're going to get dementia, like for one thing, that's just not true. And also, I mean, there's tons of women who never took hormone therapy at all and are totally fine. Like, case in point, the lovely Geraldine Pryor, who I've mentioned a few times. I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but like, she's still publishing papers. Like, she's actively doing research in her early 80s and she never took estrogen. So I'm just pointing out, like,
Right, right.
we don't like shrivel up and die without it. And also, like, some women just can't take it or have tried taking it and didn't feel good or can't for like different reasons. And I think it makes them feel pretty awful about themselves if you just like with this deficiency narrative that we have to have it. So that's there's a bigger answer than probably you expected
I'll be honest with you.
wanted. But anyway, that's, yeah. Yeah.
I have so many questions on you about it, but we would be here another hour or two.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
trying to like high level help. The thing you notice a lot about with people, and I'll say specifically women because that's what we're talking about right now, is that a lot of times people will have guilt over
I know.
how they look, what choices they're making. They want it, they're these
Sure.
natural people. So then the idea of going on something makes them feel like they're not who they say they are. And that's, oh man, they didn't
Oh,
live up to that. Or some people are just going on anything without even trying to fix insulin resistance and help their health and address some of the lifestyle things. So you get people that are coming from different places, but I think a lot of times people have guilt over the choices they're making. So I think actually it's
it's
really cool that you said that you take a low dose of that because people would look at you. You're, in my mind, you're the epitome of, um, you've dedicated your life to this and you've worked
yeah.
with probably thousands and thousands of people. So you have a lot of knowledge to draw on to make a decision like that. So when people are trying to they want to live into their ideals, I think sometimes a lot of guilt
Yeah.
goes with that. And that's all I'm trying to get from you and
Yeah.
asking the question is when do you think it is okay for that person to do that? And when do you think, hey, maybe you should don't just do that just because people are talking about it now or it became in vogue or it's back in popularity again. Like what makes that
Yeah.
decision
Yeah.
right one
Good
of that?
question. And I think um but you're right. It's good that I shared. And I haven't been withholding that information. So a few interviews I've been out, asked and I felt like it was the right place to, yeah, disclose that I do take have taken some estrogen for a few years.
But
And
why do you,
also
why?
yeah,
What was the main reason you did?
mainly for sleep for me, actually, I do find that it does improve my sleep. So, and actually, from my book, sleep has been a long time problem, which I've had shame around. And this is what you're talking about, like the guilt is actually shame, I think is like the closer word to what a lot of women feel about just whatever is happening with our bodies. Like, um, yeah, so sleep has been, yeah. So primarily for me, it would be around sleep and I guess metabolic health to some degree, although I don't have insulin resistance. So I don't, like, as you said, I'm not sure how long I'll keep it going. But um, when, yeah, I guess I don't have any definitive like when to not take it, but I will just say, like, in the current climate of fear, like, there's a lot of women. What I see happening, and is a lot of women panicked that menopause and therefore perimenopause, and menopause and perimenopause are very different, but like this panicked feeling that perimenopause is an estrogen deficiency that's going to cause dementia if they don't take it ASAP. And this would be someone who might be 42. She might have 10 years of period still ahead of her. She's got a lot going on that's none of them are estrogen deficiency at that point, right? Like she's got like, just HPA axis or potential, like, heavy periods or iron deficiency or like, I think just the strong narrative about how every woman should have access to estrogen is actually, unfortunately, kind of diluting or obscuring other things that women might need a lot more. And honestly, I just can't see, unless she's in premature menopause or actually stopped having periods. I can't see why a 42-year-old would need to take estrogen. I mean, it's going to be exceptions. There's always exceptions. I'm sure there's someone listening going, but I needed it for whatever. Like, sure, but like on average, in a typically timed perimenopause, the early 40s are a time of high estrogens. So obviously I talk about that in my book. But at some
And
point, yeah,
you
yeah,
believe progesterone actually sometimes may be the better choice for some of those symptoms?
yeah, yeah. Well,
Because
progesterone on its own. I mean, I'm an advocate for that when it's the right situation. That's coming out of Geraldine Pryor's work. Progesterone, natural progesterone, I'm talking body identical progesterone, can help to manage heavy periods, migraines, kind of premenstrual or perimenopausal migraines, sleep disturbance. So in my 40s, I did progesterone worked really well for me for sleep support and plus all the other things, magnesium and glycine. So yeah, it's a big conversation. And I guess my main message is for women out there who can't take estrogen therapy. The doctor said they can't, or they've tried it and did not feel good. I'm just saying there's other things you can do. There's lots of other ways to improve metabolic health, slow aging, feel better. Yeah,
but I think sometimes the hard part for me is I actually work with a lot of women that are doing all the right things. I really do.
yeah,
They
they
exercise
are. Yeah.
well. They are eating really clean. I know they don't have insulin resistance. Obviously, there's different body types and shapes and all these different things. But even some of those women will be, thrown off because they think they're doing all
Yeah.
the right, and they are, to be honest with you. The only thing that I ever notice is, you know, you want to make it okay for that woman to make the choice that's best for her. And then on top of
Sure.
that, I will say the one thing that I think people really do struggle with is, and I think some of this ties to your HP, A-axis stuff, is some people just can't put down the stressful life they have, whether it's sleep
Yeah.
deprivation, shift work, just being stressed because we're overwhelmed. A lot
Yeah.
of people are overwhelmed, and I think that's a big part of it.
Well, and again, in service to helping women like not feel so bad about themselves, not beat themselves up about it. Like there's only so much you can do in what you said, like women who are doing everything right, right? Like eating well, don't have insulin resistance, like exercising regularly, not having alcohol, like all the good. They've ticked all the boxes. They still have symptoms 100%. Some of that is going to be epigenetics. Some of that's just from kind of what happened earlier in their life, history of trauma. But not only that, like the recalibration phase is tough and there's a lot going on. And just briefly back to evolutionary mismatch and one more example, which is just one example, but quite interesting. There's a couple, I provide the citations in Hormone Repair Manual. There's some research to suggest, this is quite frightening actually, that those of us who were kids in the 70s were exposed to quite a bit of lead potentially, which is stored in the bones. It's just sequestered in the bones. That's the word I'm looking for. To get it out of the body, basically. And then with increased bone turnover, with the drop in estrogen, there's an increase in serum, just release of lead, basically. And lead causes neurological symptoms, including anxiety. And so, To what extent, how many women is that the factor for? I don't know. And no one knows. It's a factor. It's affecting some of us, or at least a portion of some of our symptoms. That could be me for sure. And that's just, I bring it up as an example, mainly to say that it's not your fault, right? Like evolutionary mismatch is not people's fault. We didn't choose to grow up in the 1970s with leaded petroleum and like lead in the paint, and like that was not something we did wrong. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. Like we were just
Right.
exposed to things. So that's an example to hopefully, as you know, in all my books, or especially the last two have chapters on shame and how to dispel that and how to just be realistic about the situation and not not take it on board as a failure of some kind or like a personal failing. Yeah.
No, I think that's actually one of the best parts of your books.
Yeah.
Beyond the fact that you also mentioned to get protein.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Uh, I have one last question for you before I
Okay.
wrap this up and talk about your book.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the dumbest man question you're ever going to get
Uh,
asked.
yeah.
And it is, why is it if a woman has very low hormones after
Yeah.
menopause, that
Yeah.
so many women seem so calm and sage and all this wisdom and
Mm.
so at peace, whereas those perimenopausal years are often turbulent and, as you call it, a second puberty. So why is it when if the woman has very low hormones, barely any, that you can feel so good?
That's not a dumb question at all. It's not a man question. That's like perfectly, yeah. Just it gets to the crux of the matter quite a bit, Mark. So there's another quote from Geraldine Pryor, the endocrinologist I keep quoting. I'll see if I can get it word for word. She's like, women need to know that the turbulent time of perimenopause ends in the kinder and calmer phase of life called menopause. So I hope I said that right. The turbulent years of perimenopause ends in the kinder and calmer phase of life called menopause or postmenopause. So in answer to your question, the anxiety and the turbulent symptoms are not from low estrogen. That is, again, incorrect. That is sort of a narrative that's out there that's wrong. They're from the estrogen roller coaster, which is spiking up to 3 times higher than it ever was before. Spiking estrogen causes symptoms, including histamine reactions, which can be really quite unpleasant. Dropping like a stone, that part of the roller coaster, that's estrogen withdrawal. I don't use that word lightly. That is an actual withdrawal syndrome. It is like brutal. Dropping from high to low estrogen, and the higher it goes, the farther it has to fall, is extremely unpleasant. So, and then plus progesterone just quietly, as I say in the book, progesterone just quietly leaving the scene, leaving, the poor brain just alone with the ups and downs of estrogen and no progesterone to come on board to like settle things down at all. So that's perimenopause. Then, starting it usually most estimates are, and I felt this myself because what am I now? 3 years after my final period. So around the 2 to 3 mark after the final period, you do start to get this like new stable sense. And to be fair, yes, I'm on a little bit of estrogen, but even through that, I could sort of feel this stability starting to come online. And I think it's just the recalibration, like the brain. To be clear, we're not in a state of no estrogen. Even if for women who aren't taking estrogen therapy, there is the body. Each cell makes its own estradiol. So there's still, and men make estradiol. Like estrogen is an essential hormone that men, women, and children make, and postmenopausal women make. So there is always going to be some estrogen there. Also, the receptors have all recalibrated, and the body's kind of right. It's like this is the new state. There's not zero hormones. There's still actually the amount of estrogen is about 10% of what it was during the reproductive years. So there's still quite a bit of estrogen there, even without estrogen therapy. So in answer to your question, it's a well-known observed phenomenon that after the turbulent perimenopause is over, that most women start feeling, to quote one study out of Australia, pretty fantastic. So these are the like women in their 50s and 60s. And you're right, they're not emotional. They're like just getting stuff done. And this is why right at the beginning of the conversation, we talked about how they're like the linchpin for groups, for societies. So yeah.
No, my grandmom's like the godfather of our family. She's like the
Nice.
calm, holds it all together, manages it all. She's
Yep.
been through a lot, and I know me and my uncle specifically, we look to her as like she's like the one, overseeing it all, and so calm and so, for all these years, and it's amazing. It's cool. But I always wondered that question, and I think the way you explained it was actually really cool because the body will find homeostasis and balance and make things feel normal. It'll work to do that. Even in a high sugar state, it'll become your new normal if you start to become diabetic. It's not healthy, but it will work to do
Yeah.
that. So it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about this constant flux of withdrawal and ups and downs contributing to that. Whereas even as you said, the receptors, when you get into the other side of it and you're at a low amount, 10%, the receptors can change and things can change like that. I mean, I know I'm totally separate topic, like even with drugs and
Yep.
dopamine, things like that,
Yep.
receptors and can change and change your impact. Caffeine, you know,
Well,
you can have, so
it's not a separate topic. Actually, estradiol is like a drug in the brain. It's that powerful in the brain. Like it affects neurotransmitters. It's yeah, it's a bit like a drug. It is a bit like withdrawal from a drug. It's true.
okay.
But
That's great. I feel
I
very
mean,
excited.
not that. I mean, the difference is that estradiol is, good and not, a drug. But I love that we're finishing with the story of your grandmother and how, yeah, just how important she is for your family. And that's just the story of women, right? And older women in humanity. That's such a nice story. We'll
She's
have
a
to
big
end
part
with
of
that.
the stability and the tradition. So,
I love it.
well, this was way too long and I apologize for going. So
Yeah.
yeah, I could talk to you for 2 more hours on things. What I want to say is I recommend to anyone, there's so much more to get into, so much we kind of glossed over high level that I think these 3 books, and I will show them, but the Hormone
Yeah.
Repair Manual, Theory Repair Manual, and the Metabolism Repair for Women, I think they should be like required readings for women in high school. I think if someone went
Yes.
through this, they would have a lot more understanding themselves, what they can do with their bodies, how much control and power they do have, and
Yeah.
where not to feel shame on the things that they don't have control, and what is
Exactly.
normal. So I love these books. I recommend them to everyone. At some point in time, I hope I can get my daughter to read them, but she probably gets enough of it just from living with me. So
Yeah.
appreciate your time. Is there anything last that you like for people to look you up, see your stuff, anything you're working on? That's cool. You got another book?
I do have another book idea, but I won't share it just yet. But yeah, no, I'm easy to find. All my social media is at Lara Briden. I really enjoyed our conversation, Mark, and just I think we tackled some important topics around shame, around just empowerment, and I guess a closing message for a lot of my interviews and in my books is, trust your body. Your body wants to be healthy. It knows what to do. We don't have to fight against it. We can support it. So,
I really appreciate your time.
yeah,
Hopefully
thanks so
talk
much.
to you again at some point. I
Yeah,
would love to.
yeah,
Have a good
sounds
one.
good.
And good
Yeah,
luck with everything.
yeah. Thanks so much, Mark.
All right, I'll see you later.
Bye.